Tonight, at some point after the sun goes down, you're going to reach for a switch without even thinking about it. And a room that was dark a second ago will simply be lit. No ritual, no relief, no second thought. For more than 99% of the time our species has existed, that motion, reach, flick, light wasn't just unavailable. It was unimaginable. When the sun went down, it took the entire visible world down with it. And there was nothing you could do about that, except wait. Here's the number worth sitting with. For roughly 300,000 years, every ancestor you have ever had spent something close to half of their entire life inside near total darkness. And for most of that stretch, they didn't even have a flame to push it back with. Just the sky, whatever stars weren't blotted out by cloud cover, and their own eyes, which compared to almost every serious nighttime predator sharing their landscape, were essentially useless. So the honest question is simple. What do people actually do with that much darkness for that long? The answer turns out to reach into some surprising corners. How human storytelling itself got started, and how you're built to sleep, whether or not you've ever managed to do it that way. It helps to actually picture the depth of that darkness for a second, because most people alive today have genuinely never experienced it. Not dim, not hard to see. Actual, total darkness. The kind where you can hold your own hand a few inches from your face and see nothing at all. No outline, no shadow, nothing. That's not an exaggeration for effect. Before any form of artificial light existed, on a cloud-covered new moon night, that was simply what night looked like for every single person on the planet, every time the moon happened to be absent or hidden. Modern light pollution has become so pervasive that researchers studying the night sky now estimate a large share of the world's population, including the majority of people in North America and Europe, can no longer see the Milky Way from where they sleep at all. For your ancestors, seeing it wasn't a bucket list trip to a remote national park. It was simply what the sky looked like most clear nights of their lives. Start with fire, because nothing else on this list works without it. The earliest solid physical evidence we have for humans deliberately controlling fire comes from Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, and it puts controlled fire use at somewhere around 1 million years old. That's genuinely old enough that it predates our own species. Whoever was tending that fire wasn't a modern human being at all. What fire did, once it became something a group could reliably keep alive rather than merely encounter, wasn't just warmth. It restructured the entire rhythm of the day. Before fire, our ancestors' options at night looked a lot like every other primate's. When light faded, you found somewhere defensible, up a tree, tucked into rock, and you stopped moving. Because moving in the dark meant becoming a meal for something that could see far better than you could. Human night vision is genuinely poor by the standards of the predators that shared our landscape. Leopards, hyenas, and wolves all have visual adaptations for low light that we simply never evolved. The biology behind that gap is worth spelling out because it explains just how real the danger was. Many nocturnal predators have a reflective layer behind the retina called the tapetum lucidum, essentially a built-in mirror that bounces available light back through the light-sensing cells a second time, which is also why a cat's or a dog's eyes seem to glow if you catch them in a flashlight beam at night. Human eyes have no equivalent structure at all. We also have proportionally far fewer of the specialized low-light photoreceptor cells, rod cells, packed into our retinas compared to genuinely nocturnal hunters, and our color-sensing cone cells, which dominate human daytime vision, essentially stop contributing anything useful the moment real darkness sets in. Put simply, on a moonless night, a hunting leopard could see you with startling clarity, while you, a few feet away, might not be able to make out its outline at all until it was far too close to matter. That asymmetry isn't a minor inconvenience. It's close to the single sharpest predator versus prey mismatch in the entire animal kingdom, and for most of our evolutionary history, it applied to us every single night. Fire flipped that equation. Not gradually, but essentially overnight in evolutionary terms.
A well-tended fire creates a rough perimeter of safety around it, commonly estimated at something like 30 feet, inside which most large predators simply won't approach. Step outside that ring after dark, in the kind of environment our ancestors actually lived in, and the odds shift hard against you. This isn't a romantic exaggeration either. Researchers who've spent time with modern hunter-gatherer groups have documented that individuals who wander from the fire at night remain measurably more vulnerable to predator attacks, even now, in landscapes that have far fewer large carnivores left in them than existed for most of human history.
But protection was only half of what fire did. It also handed our ancestors something they had genuinely never possessed before: more day. Without fire, your useful, active hours ended when the sun went down, somewhere around 12 hours of daylight in summer, as few as 8 in deep winter at higher latitudes. Fire added a real, usable extension to that window, something on the order of 2 to 4 additional hours, where a group could still see well enough to work, eat, and, crucially, talk. Multiply that extension across thousands of generations, and you're not looking at a minor convenience. You're looking at a fundamental restructuring of how much time our species had access to for anything beyond immediate survival tasks. What did people actually do with those extra firelit hours? In 2014, the anthropologist Polly Wiesner published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, built on years of fieldwork recording real conversations among the Jew Hawansi, a San people of the Kalahari Desert, who represent one of the closest living approximations we have to a foraging lifestyle, broadly similar to how our species lived for most of its history. Wiesner's data showed a sharp, consistent split. During daylight hours, conversation ran overwhelmingly practical, roughly 80% of it. Logistics, complaints, negotiations over resources, who's hunting where, which plants are ready to gather.
Daytime talk, in other words, was work talk. But once the fire was lit and the group settled around it, the entire character of conversation flipped. Wiesner found that at night, something like 81% of conversation shifted towards stories. Tales about people in distant places, accounts of past hunts reshaped into something closer to legend, myths explaining where the world came from, jokes sharp enough to make an entire camp laugh at once. Wiesner's own interpretation was direct. Firelit conversation functioned as something close to the birthplace of a huge share of human culture. The fire wasn't only warmth and safety, it was the original theater, the original classroom, arguably the original site of anything resembling organized religion, the specific setting where people first had the sustained, safe, attention-holding conditions needed to think past the present moment and imagine things that didn't exist yet. Wiesner also noted something specific about who tended to speak during those nighttime sessions, and it complicates the simple picture of daytime being purely about young, able-bodied hunters directing everything. Older members of the group, including individuals well past their prime hunting years, were disproportionately responsible for carrying the camp's store of stories, and their status within the group during those firelit hours often had very little to do with physical capability and everything to do with memory, timing, and performance skill. In a foraging economy where daytime status could hinge heavily on what you'd contributed to that day's food supply, night effectively opened up a second parallel economy of status, one built on knowledge and storytelling ability instead,
giving older or less physically capable group members a route to real social importance that the daylight hours alone wouldn't have offered them. There's a reasonable case that this nightly shift from transactional daytime speech to expansive, imaginative nighttime speech mattered enormously for how human cognition itself developed. Planning a hunt requires tracking what's real, right now, in front of you. A myth explaining the origin of the stars requires something categorically different. Holding an idea in your head that has no direct physical referent at all, and trusting that the people listening will follow you there. Fire didn't just make that kind of thinking safer to attempt. By clearing out several extra hours a day, specifically hours with nothing urgent left to do, it may have made that kind of thinking almost inevitable. Firelight explains what people did with their extra waking hours. It doesn't explain what's arguably an even stranger part of this story: what ancient humans did with the actual architecture of sleep itself.
something scientists only really rediscovered within the last few decades. Here's the claim, and it's a genuinely disorienting one if you've spent your entire life assuming 8 consolidated hours is simply how human sleep works. You may not have been built to sleep the way you currently sleep at all. In 2001, the historian Roger Eckerch, who'd spent roughly 16 years combing through pre-industrial records, published a study in the American Historical Review that reshaped how historians think about nighttime entirely. He'd pulled together more than 500 separate references, spanning centuries and multiple languages, court depositions, private diaries, medical texts, prayer manuals, even passages reaching as far back as Homer. And every one of them pointed at the same basic pattern: people going to bed, then referred to explicitly as their first sleep, waking somewhere in the middle of the night, staying up for an hour or more in what period sources sometimes called the watch, and then settling into a second sleep that carried them through to dawn. This wasn't described anywhere in these sources as a disorder or an inconvenience. It reads across 5 centuries of scattered, independent documentation as simply normal, unremarkable, the ordinary shape of a night. What did people actually do during that gap between first and second sleep? A wide range of things, based on what survives in the record. A 16th century French physician apparently recommended that gap specifically as an especially favorable window for couples to conceive. People used it to visit neighbors, tend a dying fire, or interpret a dream while it was still fresh enough to remember clearly. Some sources describe people simply lying still in the dark, thinking, in language remarkably close to how a modern person might describe quiet, unhurried reflection. A doctor's manual from the 1500s specifically recommended the watch as the best possible time for serious study and contemplation, precisely because the mind, in that window, was supposedly at its calmest. What makes Eckerch's discovery even stranger is how thoroughly this pattern had been erased from historical memory before he went looking for it. Translators working on older texts, encountering phrases equivalent to first sleep, had for generations rendered them in ways that quietly smoothed the phrase into something closer to modern single-block sleep. Apparently because the idea of routinely broken sleep being completely normal simply didn't occur to translators who had never experienced anything but consolidated sleep themselves. The assumption ran so deep, it altered translations of ancient Greek and medieval Latin texts without anyone particularly noticing they were doing it. Then, in the early 1990s, biology seemed to back the historical record up. The psychiatrist Thomas Ware, working at the National Institute of Mental Health, ran a study in which a small group of participants had their light exposure sharply restricted, roughly 14 hours of enforced darkness a night for a month, deliberately mimicking the kind of long winter night our ancestors would have experienced before artificial lighting stretched the usable evening. Within a few weeks, every single participant, without being told what pattern to expect, settled into the same rhythm the historical record described: roughly 4 hours of sleep, a stretch of 1 to 3 hours of quiet wakefulness, then another 4-hour stretch of sleep until it was time to rise. Ware also measured hormone levels during that middle waking period and found something specific. Participants showed elevated levels of prolactin, a hormone otherwise associated with states like meditation and the period following orgasm, and they described the experience itself as unusually calm, almost meditative, distinct from ordinary daytime wakefulness in a way that's hard to summarize, except to say it apparently felt like its own separate mode of consciousness, one that essentially nobody living under modern lighting conditions ever gets to experience firsthand. It's worth being honest about where this picture gets more complicated, because the segmented sleep story has occasionally been presented, especially online, as a settled, universal fact about human biology, and the actual scientific picture is a bit messier than that. A widely cited 2015 study, led by the sleep researcher Jerome Siegel, examined sleep patterns directly, using activity monitors among 3 modern groups living largely without electric light: the Hadza of Tanzania, the San of Namibia, and the Tsimane of Bolivia. None of the 3 groups showed the clear 2-phase first sleep, second sleep pattern Eckerch had documented in historical Europe. Their nightly sleep looked comparatively consolidated, averaging somewhere in the range of 6.5 to 7 hours. with minimal daytime napping. That doesn't necessarily contradict Ericage's historical research, which was drawn specifically from pre-industrial European and North American sources, rather than from foraging societies directly. But it's a meaningful complication worth holding on to. Segmented sleep may have been a genuine, well-documented pattern in the specific historical populations Ericage studied, without being some single, universal biological default hardwired into every human population regardless of climate, culture, or latitude. The truth here looks less like humans were built to sleep in two phases, and more like human sleep architecture is considerably more flexible and more responsive to light exposure and cultural context than the rigid 8-hour block most of us now treat as the only normal option. There's a related smaller thread of research worth mentioning here too, because it points at another layer of nighttime rhythm modern life has mostly flattened out: the moon.
A widely discussed 2013 study, led by the chronobiologist Christian Jochen, found that participants sleeping in a lab, with no view of the sky and no idea what lunar phase it currently was, still showed measurable differences in sleep quality tied to the moon's cycle, taking longer to fall asleep, sleeping somewhat less overall, and showing reduced deep sleep activity around the full moon compared to other points in the cycle. Later attempts to replicate that specific finding produced mixed results, and the broader scientific consensus remains genuinely unsettled on how strong or reliable a lunar effect on human sleep actually is. But it's a strange thing even to be a live scientific question at all in a world flooded with artificial light every single night, regardless of what the moon happens to be doing. For most of human history, the moon wasn't background trivia. Its cycle governed how much usable light existed after dark at all, changing hunting strategy, travel timing, and quite possibly sleep itself, in a way that a permanently lit modern bedroom has made almost entirely irrelevant to check. Whatever the precise universality of the pattern, something about modern life clearly did change dramatically, and we can trace roughly when and why with real precision, because it tracks the spread of artificial light almost step for step.
Cities began installing early street lighting in the 1600s. Paris was among the first, under Louis XIV, largely as a measure against nighttime crime, and other European capitals followed. For the first time in the story of our species, night itself, at least within city limits, started to become genuinely navigable territory, rather than something to be sealed off from until dawn. Cheaper candles extended that reach further into ordinary households. Gas lighting arrived in the 1800s, illuminating streets and homes at a scale candlelight never could. Then, in 1879, Thomas Edison commercialized a genuinely practical incandescent bulb, and within roughly a single generation, the specific texture of night that had shaped every human life for 300,000 years was functionally gone across large parts of the industrialized world. There's a piece of this history embedded directly in language that's easy to miss. The word curfew descends from the French couvre-feu, meaning quite literally, cover the fire. In medieval towns, a bell would ring at a set hour each night as a signal for households to bank or extinguish their fires. The original justification tied to this custom wasn't really about crime prevention specifically. It reflected a much older, deeper assumption that night was simply supposed to be dark, that darkness was when a household slept, and that anyone still moving through it afterward was, by definition, doing something worth suspecting.
Walking through many medieval European towns after dark without a lantern wasn't merely unwise. In a considerable number of jurisdictions, it was flatly illegal. Night, across an enormous span of human history, wasn't neutral, unclaimed time. It belonged, in the collective imagination, to criminals, to the supernatural, to whatever people most feared. And that fear ran deep enough and lasted long enough that it's genuinely hard for anyone living under modern street lighting to fully reconstruct what it must have felt like. That fear shows up constantly once you start looking for it in pre-industrial writing and folklore. E. Kirch's own broader research into the history of night, beyond just sleep specifically, catalogs an enormous body of period beliefs, assigning night its own distinct set of dangers, separate from ordinary daytime crime. Restless spirits, witches believed to be more active after dark, an entire category of supernatural threat that simply didn't apply in the same way once the sun was up.
Many households kept some form of light burning through at least part of the night, not purely for practical reasons, but explicitly to ward off exactly those imagined threats, a habit that shows up across an enormous range of unrelated cultures and time periods. It's worth pointing out how strange this actually is from a modern vantage point. For most of history, an ordinary, unremarkable person genuinely believed the dark itself, not merely what might be hiding inside it, carried a kind of danger that simply evaporated with daylight. That's not a fear modern people carry in anything like the same form, mostly because modern people have never had to.
And then, within the span of not much more than a century, we didn't just push back against that fear. We effectively erased the condition that had produced it. And we filed the whole thing away as straightforward progress, without spending much time asking what specifically got traded away in the process. Here's a rough sketch of what that trade actually looks like, in strictly physiological terms. The average person in an industrialized country is now exposed to meaningful amounts of artificial light for something like 7 to 8 hours after sunset, night after night, for their entire adult life. That light, particularly the blue-shifted wavelengths that dominate most screens, actively suppresses the body's production of melatonin, the hormone primarily responsible for regulating the onset of sleep. Your retina, fundamentally, cannot distinguish between a light bulb and a rising sun. When meaningful light hits it late at night, the brain interprets that signal as daytime, regardless of the actual hour, delays melatonin release accordingly, and in doing so, quietly disrupts a circadian rhythm that took millions of years of evolutionary pressure to calibrate in the first place. Researchers studying this specific effect have found that even a single week of camping, with genuinely no artificial light exposure at all, is enough to shift a person's melatonin onset by close to 2 hours, moving it back towards sunset rather than several hours after it. That's a remarkably small intervention required to reset a rhythm that, from the body's perspective, never actually stopped expecting darkness to mean darkness. The part of the brain actually running this whole system is a small cluster of neurons called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, sitting just above where the optic nerves cross, positioned there specifically because it needs direct, constant access to information about ambient light levels. It functions as the body's master clock, syncing not just sleep and wakefulness, but core body temperature, hormone release, and even digestive rhythms to a roughly 24-hour cycle, calibrated primarily by exactly the kind of light versus darkness signal that fire, and later, far more disruptively, electric light, started interfering with. That system evolved across an almost unimaginable stretch of time, under conditions where the only light source after sunset was firelight, moonlight, or nothing at all. It has had, from an evolutionary standpoint, essentially no time to adapt to a world where a phone screen at midnight sends it the same basic signal as noon. Which brings the story back to something worth taking seriously, rather than dismissing as a minor curiosity. If Egert's historical pattern really was as widespread across pre-industrial Europe as the 500-plus references he collected suggest, then the specific, reflective, quietly meditative waking state where, measured decades later, elevated prolactin, a calm, almost trance-like quality to conscious thought, essentially doesn't exist anymore for most people living under modern lighting conditions, because the sustained darkness required to produce it in the first place has been almost entirely engineered out of daily life. What we have instead, when we wake at 2 or 3 in the morning and can't immediately fall back asleep, tends to get labeled a disorder, something to be corrected, medicated, or anxious about. It's worth at least entertaining a stranger possibility that for at least some people, in at least some historical contexts, waking in the middle of the night wasn't a malfunction at all. It may have been the last surviving fragment of a rhythm the body once expected to run on as a matter of course, showing up in a world that no longer has any darkness left for it to unfold inside of it. Pull the whole arc together, and you get something like this. For 300,000 years, night was the single most dangerous, most tightly governed stretch of every single day your ancestors lived through. Dangerous enough that an entire branch of human technology, fire management, existed largely to manage it. Once that danger was contained, the extra hours fire bought weren't spent idly. Based on the clearest evidence we have from groups living something close to that original rhythm, they were spent overwhelmingly on story, myth, and the kind of expansive, imaginative conversation that daytime, task-focused talk rarely makes room for. And for a very long stretch of more recent history, quite possibly not universally, but genuinely widely across pre-industrial Europe and beyond, the night itself contained a second, quieter gift buried inside ordinary sleep architecture. A deliberate pause near the middle of the dark. A window some people used for connection, for reflection, for simply lying still and thinking, before drifting back under until first light. We didn't lose all of that gradually, through some slow, barely noticeable cultural drift. We traded it, with remarkable speed, for a single flick of a switch. And on balance, it's a trade almost nobody would seriously want to reverse. Modern lighting has unambiguously made nights safer, more productive, and less frightening in ways that matter.
But it's still worth noticing, every so often, what exactly got carried out the door along with the danger. The next time you wake at 2 in the morning, restless, annoyed, already reaching for your phone to check the time, it might be worth pausing for just a moment before you do. Somewhere underneath that irritation, maybe one of the oldest, quietest rhythms your body has ever run, surfacing in a world that, for the first time in 300,000 years, no longer has anywhere dark enough left for it to finish. None of this is really an argument for switching off every light in your house tonight. Modern lighting has saved an enormous number of lives, made cities genuinely safer to move through after dark, and quietly erased a category of fear that shaped human behavior for most of our history. But it's worth holding two things at once here: gratitude for what artificial light solved, and at least a little curiosity about what it happened to take with it in the process. The dark our ancestors lived inside for 300,000 years wasn't empty time waiting to be improved on. It had its own architecture, its own rituals, its own particular use for the mind, one built entirely out of firelight, patience, and whatever the moon happened to be doing that night. We didn't outgrow that architecture, so much as switch it off, all at once, faster than any biological system built over millions of years could realistically be expected to keep up with.